Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Recently, someone almost died falling on one of climbing's most iconic routes, and it's caused a bit of a controversy that I kind of find ridiculous. This is the route Snake Dike. It ascends the southwestern face of Yosemite's Half Dome, coming in at 8 pitches and about 5'7". Now, if you're familiar with the route, or if you just know anything about climbing grades at all, you're probably already typing up a comment telling me why I'm stupid for calling this the most dangerous route in the climbing world. I'm going to get to why I think it deserves that title in a minute, but first I just want to touch on the history of the route and what's happened recently to bring it back into the limelight. Snake Dike was established in 1970 by Eric Beck, Jim Bridwell, and Chris Fredericks, who all formed sort of the second generation of Yosemite's great climbers. In his book about that period in Yosemite history, author Steve Roper says this: "What makes this climb, Snake Dike, significant concerns the bolts. Good climbers can romp up 5'6" without worrying much about protection, and the trio on the first ascent did just that. When they got to the top, the threesome immediately realized they'd screwed up. Here was a perfect beginner's climb. It would obviously become a classic, yet it had no protection and inadequate belay anchors, a poor prospect for beginners. For this reason, no one climbed the route again during the remainder of the summer. In November 1965, I asked the first ascenders if they'd mind if I went up and stuck bolts in key places. They agreed, and I did the climb in 1966, adding 4 bolts, mainly at belay stations. Ever since 1966, the bolting on Snake Dike has remained pretty much the same. I did the climb this summer, and I can attest that it's not well bolted. Specifically, on pitches 2, 3, and 4, there are long sections with no bolts and nowhere to place gear. 20 to 30 foot runouts are pretty standard, and the worst of it, you're run out 40 feet. This means if you fall, you're going 80 to 100 feet before your rope catches you. It's also significant to note that Snake Dike is less than vertical. This isn't going to be a clean fall like that one video of Tommy on the Dawn Wall. You're going to tumble and roll on the way down, which is going to make the injuries worse. That's exactly what happened to New Zealand climber Anna Parsons, who fell on Snake Dike in August of this year. Anna's list of injuries was gruesome. She hurt her neck, spine, pelvis, ribs, and feet. In fact, one of her feet was so badly damaged that she opted for surgery to have it amputated. Because this happened in America, she also racked up more than $1 million worth of medical bills for her treatment post-fall. Now, it's worth pointing out that Anna is doing fine and for the most part has remained positive. She has a GoFundMe that you can check out. I will link it in the description. I'm not sure if it's still going, but I'll put it down there anyways. But the point still stands. That's a pretty horrifying fall. After the news broke of her fall, there was immediately a discussion as to whether bolts should be added to make the route safer. In most places in the world, it probably would have happened automatically, but this is Yosemite, and so things weren't quite that easy. See, the valley still revolves around this old school climbing ethic. Bolts are tolerated in Yosemite on long sections of slab, but if you can protect something with traditional gear, you better not put a bolt anywhere close to it. Additionally, there's a deeply held belief that the first person to send a route gets to decide where the bolts go and how many bolts are on that route. Even more than that, though, there's this pervading idea in the valley climbing community that on some level, rock climbing should have an element of risk to it. Now, this isn't exclusive to the valley, as evidenced by this climbing.com article literally titled "Climbing Should Be Dangerous," but I can say firsthand I noticed it more when I was in Yosemite than when I was in Red Rocks. Because of this, when Parsons fell and the conversation for more bolts started, some people reacted poorly. Parsons herself is a fairly experienced climber, although notably she doesn't have a lot of valley experience, and that sort of ties into what I was thinking about when I labeled Snake Dike the most dangerous route in the world. Before I talk about that though, we need to hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Guys, I've done a lot of ads with Squarespace before in the past, and it's honestly because I genuinely think they have a great platform. They're the best place to build a website and promote your personal brand if you don't have coding experience and you don't want to have to worry about building stuff from the ground up. You can pick from the website theme that you want, you can create exclusive content, you can view analytics, you can link to your socials. There's a lot of stuff you can do to make it as easy as possible to build the best website you possibly can. If you want to launch your own personal brand, start an online business, or just offer content online, Squarespace is the best place to do it. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial and use the code Ascensionism for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain if you want to give the channel a little bit of support. The reason that I think Snake Dike is so dangerous is not because of how hard the moves are. It's because of how much harder the moves are than you think they're going to be. Let me explain. Anyone who's ever climbed in Yosemite can attest that the valley has a pretty unique style to it, even compared to other granite meccas. I've climbed in Squamish and Index and Taquitos, places in the west coast of America that have big granite climbing, and the valley still took me a couple days of easy routes on areas like the Swan Slab and the Camp 4 boulders before I actually felt comfortable on some of the more difficult pitches. The rock is incredibly smooth, the features are tiny, and even some of the cracks feel frictionless. By the time I got to Yosemite, I'd spent 3 weeks doing granite climbing in places like Big Bear Lake and Taquitos in Idlewild, which is actually where Royal Robbins learned to climb, which is pretty cool. And again, I still felt like I had to get my feet under me at Yosemite before I was ready to climb Yosemite. I'd also at this point spent a lot of time practicing long trad runouts and even some easy soloing because I knew that was something I wanted to explore in the valley, and before taking on routes like Snake Dike, I wanted to have experience being very far above my protection and still having to do moderately challenging moves. See, the thing about Snake Dike is it's not 5.7 or even 5.4, because most of the routes are really great at 5.4, in the way that most people are going to be used to. Right? If you look at like a sandstone 5.4 or just a 5.4 at the gym, I'm going to assume that most people watching this video could probably climb it with their eyes closed. There's handholds everywhere. That's not the case on Snake Dike. Again, I'm no Tommy Caldwell, but I would say I'm a reasonably competent granite beginner. I did other Yosemite classics like Moby Dick and Backer Cracker, which isn't super relevant to this video, but I just wanted to brag about it. And there were still times on Snake Dike where I felt uncomfortable with the combination of the runouts and the moves I was doing. There are a lot of features on the route because you're following this big dike, but there's not always good handholds. The feet are incredibly slippery, and if you get nervous, there's nowhere where you can place gear. This is a style of climbing that most people are just not familiar with. Yosemite in recent years especially has gained this kind of mythical status to it. I think films like Valley Uprising and Free Solo have made it so that climbers dream of going to Yosemite and climbing the routes there, and they should. It's fucking awesome. It's so cool. The problem is, though, I think most of the people who come to Yosemite to climb Snake Dike, or at least a good portion of them, are not accustomed to that type of climbing. My worry is those people are going to come to Yosemite and immediately they're going to add Snake Dike to their to-do list. For good reason. It looks super doable. It's 5.7, most of the climbing is 5.4, it's only 8 pitches. The thing is, though, there are stories of people being caught out by the difficulty of the route. Look at this comment, for example. I've climbed 5.13 on sandstone, but granite friction is unnerving. Or this. For context, I mostly boulder. This was my 4th climb in Yosemite, so definitely somewhat inexperienced in this style. I felt like some of the comments were totally different from my experience. This is exactly what scares me about Snake Dike. I don't want to take shots at this commenter, but I'm worried that as more and more people get introduced to climbing through indoors and gym climbing, more and more people are going to see Yosemite as the mecca of the climbing universe. They're going to come to Yosemite, they're going to see Snake Dike being held up as this sort of valley classic, this rite of passage, and they're going to want to do it because it's only 5.7, but the climbing that they do in a gym, you could be a 5.10 gym climber on overhung boulders. That is not going to prepare you for when you're doing friction slab moves 30 feet above your bolt. That's why I called Snake Dike the most dangerous route in the world, even though I'm sure some of you are going to think I'm dumb for doing so. When you think of what would typically be considered the most dangerous route in the world, like Lexicon or Rhapsody or the Backer Yarian, the people who are climbing those routes are going into it knowing what they're getting into with the training and preparation to be prepared for the danger that they're going to face. I do not feel comfortable saying that the people who are going to climb Snake Dike have that same knowledge and comfort base. A lot of them do, of course, but I think there's a segment of people who don't, and that's why I think the route is so dangerous. You come into it thinking you can climb that degree of difficulty because you climb it in other circumstances, and before you know it, you're 30 feet above your bolt with nowhere to place gear, and At that point, all it takes is one foot slip. That's exactly what happened to Parsons. Now, I don't think she was too inexperienced to be on this route, but one of her feet slipped after she got slightly off route and she went for that terrible fall. Her partner, thankfully, was experienced enough to tie off and try to prusik up to her. When he realized that wasn't possible, he called Yosar and they were able to get her off pretty quickly. Parsons' fall immediately sparked the debate about whether more bolts should be added to Snake Dike. Surprisingly to me, some old school climbers who were pretty comfortable with danger were in favor of it. Peter Croft, for example, was in favor of adding enough bolts to prevent route navigational errors like what happened to Parsons. With one bolt every 30 feet, it's actually really easy to get off route on the dike and find yourself in some pretty nasty 510 terrain. John Long, too, essentially echoed what I'm saying above. I am for adding bolts to dangerous moderates. After gym/sport climbing became the norm, climbers no longer understood the old trad credo that it isn't real till there's skin in the game. So some don't have the mental faculties to deal with the risk and people get hurt. This doesn't need to happen on moderate routes, so add bolts. Not everyone agreed with this though. Peter Takita, the editor of Accidents in North American Climbing, had this to say. Retrobolting Snake Dike would dishonor the first ascensionist and also robbed everyone of the chance to experience a great route in which the positioning, exposure, and runouts play a role in the overall experience. This is purely an opinion piece, but I find this not super convincing. There's something to be said about honoring first ascensionists, sure, and I'm going to get to that in a moment, but especially on Snake Dike, I really just don't like this argument that adding bolts takes away from the experience of people who want to climb it with danger. I get a bit of an argument how bolting it takes away from the experience, but I think it's outweighed by the danger that I was talking about above. Jesse Jackson, a former Rock and Ice editor, was also against retro bolting, saying, long-established classics like Snake Dike have been done hundreds of times without incident, so why do we need to retro bolt? Not every route needs to be safe and accessible to every climber. Here, I sort of agree with Jesse. Not every route should be bolted. I would be pretty mad if people started putting up bolts on Taquitos or the Smoke Bluffs in Squamish, but Snake Dike has reached such a level of popularity that it represents a public health hazard. People are going to want to climb it because it's labeled as this Yosemite classic, this rite of passage, and you can't stop them from climbing it. You can't put in some sort of mandatory experience they need to do, so you might as well just add the bolts to make sure they're safe while they're doing it. This debate was mostly settled when Eric Beck, one of the first ascensionists of the route, spoke up. As Roper said, the first people to climb it didn't avoid bolting it out of some statement of the danger or because they wanted it to be this test piece. It was literally just these were Yosemite dirtbags. They wanted to save time and they wanted to save money, so they only put in bolts where they felt they needed them, and that was only the belay anchors. Beck is actually highly in favor of adding bolts. He was the one who encouraged Roper to add those bolts in 1966, and recently, when asked about it, he encouraged more bolts, saying, "It may look like I want to defang Snake Dike and bring it down to the lowest common denominator, but Snake Dike is not a test piece. It has no fangs. It is a lovely route on one of the greatest monoliths of our planet. Had we had more time and more bolts, we would have done it ourselves." To me, that basically settles the debate. The first ascensionist doesn't just approve of more bolts, he's basically imploring people to add them, and yet they haven't. Why? This is purely conjecture, but if I had to guess, it's because there's still some people in the valley who don't approve of it. No one wants to put in the time, money, and effort it takes to hand drill bolts all the way up on Half Dome, only for some valley local Sean Snyder wannabe to come along and chop them the next day. So as it stands, that's the situation at Snake Dike. That's the state it's still in. Again, I obviously have my thoughts and I think I've made them clear, but I do have to acknowledge that this is an important subject in both the Yosemite area and climbing overall. So I'm curious, what do you guys think? Am I off base here? Let me know in a comment. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.